Melissa Holt scrutinized her reflection in the mirrored elevator door, 30th floor. Just a moment more, and the doors would open to a lavish party hosted by one of Cincinnati's most influential real estate companies. In her 29, she was already one of the top agents, but she'd always wanted more. "You look amazing," Derek, her husband, whispered, adjusting his tie. At 41, he was still a handsome man. The gray on his temples only made him look more solid, emphasizing his status as a successful financial advisor. When the elevator doors opened, the Holt couple saw a picture worthy of a glossy magazine cover. The penthouse was bathed in the dim light of designer lamps, and the panoramic windows offered a breathtaking view of the city at night. Melissa spotted her boss immediately, and taking her husband under her elbow, headed toward him. "Melissa, Derek, glad you could make it," exclaimed Richard Parker, the owner of the agency. "Meet Jason Ward, professor of psychology, and his wife Carrie." Melissa extended her hand to a young man with an attentive gaze and a slight half-smile. He looked no more than 35. Jason was the kind of man who attracted attention not by his good looks, but by his inner confidence and charisma. "Nice to meet you." Jason's voice was deep and calm. "Richard told me about your impressive career in real estate. I hope he wasn't exaggerating my accomplishments." Melissa smiled, turning her gaze to Carrie. The professor's wife was a fragile blonde with surprisingly shrewd eyes. There was a deliberate carelessness to her look that could only belong to someone with impeccable taste. "I'm a graphic designer," Carrie introduced herself, as if reading Melissa's mute question. "By the way, we may have worked together indirectly. I did the layouts for the brochures for the Oak Valley apartment complex." "Really? I sold 3 townhouses there last month. Your brochures played a big part in that," Melissa marveled sincerely. Time flew by. After a few glasses of champagne, the conversation became more lively and personal. Derek, usually reserved in the company of strangers, was discussing psychological theories with Jason, and Melissa and Carrie discovered that they had many interests in common. "You know, we just moved to Ohio from California," Carrie said, "and to be honest, we're a little bit missing that more open lifestyle." Melissa caught the implication in her words, but she couldn't be sure what Carrie meant. "What do you mean by open lifestyle?" she asked, sipping her champagne. Carrie exchanged a quick glance with her husband, and Jason nodded imperceptibly. "Let's just say that in San Francisco, we had a more experimental social circle," Carrie said quietly. "People who weren't afraid to explore the boundaries of traditional relationships." Melissa felt her pulse quicken. She and Derek had never talked about it openly, but in the last year their marriage had become more routine, more predictable. Melissa sometimes caught herself thinking she missed the thrill, the excitement she'd felt at the beginning of the relationship. "Sounds intriguing," she replied cautiously, glancing at Derek. Her husband seemed completely absorbed in his conversation with Jason, but Melissa knew he was always listening intently, even when he seemed distracted. "Why don't we continue this conversation in a more private?" Carrie suggested. "At our house, for example, this Friday." All week, Melissa couldn't think about anything else. She wondered if she should talk to Derek about the invitation. What if she misread Carrie's hints? What if Derek would be shocked by such an offer? But to her surprise, when she did decide to bring it up, her husband's reaction was unexpectedly calm. "I thought that's where this was going," he said, keeping his eyes on his laptop. Jason had hinted at something like this too. "What do you think about it?" Melissa asked cautiously. Derek closed the laptop and looked at his wife for the first time all evening. "Honestly, I think we both missed the thrill. 7 years of marriage is enough time to start experimenting if we both want to." Melissa looked at her husband in surprise. In all their years together, she'd never thought he could be so open. "But we have to have rules," Derek added. "Clear boundaries." "Of course," Melissa agreed hastily. "No emotional attachments? Everything just for fun." The Ward's house turned out to be a cozy, modern cottage in an upscale neighborhood. When Melissa and Derek arrived, Carrie was already waiting for them at the door, dressed in a simple but elegant black dress. "Come on in," she smiled. "Jason is in the living room making cocktails." Melissa felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. It was like a first date, only 1,000 times more exciting. Jason greeted them with a friendly smile, handing them each a glass of some exotic cocktail. "To new horizons," he toasted. After a few cocktails and casual conversation, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Melissa noticed that Carrie was touching Derek more and more often, casual touches of her hand, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Jason, for his part, was moving closer and closer to her. "Why don't we do a little experiment?" Jason suggested, when the tension became almost palpable. "A psychological one." "What kind of experiment?" Derek asked, his voice lower than usual. "A truth game. Everyone asks a question that everyone has to answer honestly. That way we get to know each other better and our preferences." They started with innocuous questions, but soon the game took a more explicit turn. Melissa learned that Carrie fantasized about women, that Jason preferred to be dominated, and Derek, to her surprise, admitted that he'd always wanted to see her with another man. "Enough talk," Carrie finally said, getting up from the couch and holding out her hand to Derek. "Shall we go upstairs?" Melissa met her husband's gaze. The silent question in his eyes read, "Are you sure?" She nodded faintly, and Derek took Carrie's hand and headed for the stairs. Jason moved closer to Melissa. His presence was both intimidating and exciting. "Are you nervous?" he asked, gently pulling a strand of hair away from her face. "A little," she admitted. "Everything is happening so fast. We could stop at any moment," Jason said softly. "But I hope you don't want us to." That night, the boundaries weren't just crossed, they were erased. Melissa had discovered a side of herself she hadn't even known existed, and in Jason, she'd found a partner who seemed to understand her desires before she realized them. It was the first of many encounters. What started as an experiment quickly turned into regular dates. Every weekend, the two couples met at either the Holt's or the Ward's place, exploring new facets of sensuality. But somewhere around the third month, Melissa began to notice a change. The intimate chemistry between her and Jason seemed to go beyond physical attraction. She caught herself thinking about him in the middle of the day, remembering not only their passionate nights, but their conversations, his looks, his laughter. And worst of all, she began to compare Jason to Derek, and not always in her husband's favor. Derek, for his part, seemed increasingly infatuated with Carrie. One day, Melissa accidentally overheard him on the phone. He was arranging a meeting with Carrie that didn't include her or Jason. That's breaking the rules, Melissa thought, but then realized that she had been furtively texting Jason herself. In the 6th month of their unusual romance, Melissa sensed that something was wrong. She put it down to stress and fatigue, until one morning she threw up in a meeting. The pregnancy test she'd bought that same day showed 2 clear bars. Melissa sat on the edge of the tub, unable to take her eyes off the test. Who was the father, Derek or Jason? They were careful, but obviously not careful enough. What would she tell Derek? And to Jason? And how would Carrie react? Something that started out as a game suddenly turned into reality with all its complicated implications. "Are you sure?" Derek asked, looking at the test Melissa had placed in front of him. "Absolutely," she nodded. "I took 3 different tests." Derek ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he only did when he was really worried. He stammered, struggling to find the words. "Do you know who—" "No," Melissa answered honestly. "It could be either you or Jason." Derek stood up and walked to the window. His silhouette against the evening sky seemed strangely lonely. "Oh, what are you going to do?" he asked without turning around. Melissa felt a lump come to her throat. She'd been thinking about it ever since she'd seen the test results, and she still wasn't sure. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think I want to keep the baby." Derek turned around slowly. His face was unreadable. "Do you realize what that means? If the baby isn't mine—" "I know," Melissa interrupted him, "but I want a paternity test as soon as possible. And then we'll decide how to proceed." "We have to tell them," Derek said after a long pause. "Jason and Carrie, they have a right to know." Melissa nodded. The thought of the upcoming conversation made her ache almost physically. They met at a neutral place, a small, cozy restaurant on the outskirts of town. Melissa would have preferred a more private setting, but Derek had insisted on a public place. "Everyone will be more comfortable that way," he said, though Melissa suspected he was just afraid of overreacting emotionally. Jason and Carrie were already waiting for them at a table in the far corner of the hall. As soon as Melissa saw Jason's face, she realized she couldn't hide her condition. She was sure that her feelings for him had long since crossed the forbidden line from mere physical attraction to something far more dangerous. "You have such serious faces." Carrie smiled as they sat down at the table. "Is something wrong?" Melissa looked at Derek, expecting him to start a conversation, but he remained silent, staring at the menu. "Yes," Melissa finally said, pulling herself together. "Something did happen. Yeah, I'm pregnant." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Carrie froze with the glass of wine in her hand, unable to bring it to her lips. Jason straightened, his gaze sharp and attentive. "And who—" Carrie began, but couldn't finish the question. "We don't know," Derek answered for his wife. "That remains to be seen." Jason was silent, but his eyes stayed fixed on Melissa. There was something in them that she couldn't quite interpret. Surprise, fear, hope. "What are you planning to do?" he asked quietly. "I want to keep the baby," Melissa answered firmly, "and get a paternity test as soon as possible." "And if—" Carrie hesitated, then started again. "What if Derek's not the father?" That question hung in the air. None of them were prepared to answer it. How could four adults who had deliberately entered into a complicated relationship be so unprepared for one of the most obvious consequences? "We'll deal with problems as they come," Derek finally said. Right now, the most important thing was to support Melissa and make sure the baby was all right. Melissa looked at her husband gratefully. Despite all the difficulties, he'd stayed by her side, ready to accept any outcome. But something in Jason's eyes made her shudder inwardly. It was the look of a man who wasn't going to back down, no matter what happened. And in that moment, Melissa realized that their game, their experiment, had gone far beyond the rules, and the consequences could be far more serious than either of them had realized. 7 weeks. Melissa sat in the chair looking at the first ultrasound. The tiny lump in the black and white image seemed so abstract it was hard to believe. A new life was growing inside her. In a few months, that blurry image would become a real person, her baby. She still couldn't figure out how to feel about her pregnancy. Joy mingled with fear, anticipation with anxiety. She'd always wanted children, but she'd imagined it would happen in more traditional circumstances. The sound of the front door opening brought her out of her reverie. Derek had gotten home from work earlier than usual. "How was the appointment?" he asked, coming into the living room and glancing at the picture in her hands. "It was fine. The doctor says the development is on track." Derek nodded and sat down across from her. His gaze slid over the scan again, but it didn't have the excitement that fathers-to-be usually have. Just wariness and a kind of painful determination. "I signed up for a DNA test," he said after a pause. "They can take a sample early in the pregnancy, safe for the baby." It was expected, but still uncomfortable. From the moment she'd announced the pregnancy, their relationship had changed. Derek had never been a particularly emotional person, but now it was like he'd built an extra wall around himself. "Are you sure you want to know now?" Melissa asked cautiously. "Shouldn't we wait? What difference would it make?" Derek's voice was bitter. "If I'm not the father, the sooner we find out, the better for everyone." Melissa wanted to object, but the phone interrupted their conversation. Jason's name popped up on the screen. He'd called almost every day since they'd last met at the restaurant, asking how she was doing. "Aren't you going to answer it?" Derek nodded at the phone, a mixture of resentment and resignation in his eyes. "I'll call you back later." Melissa dropped the call. "Derek, we need to talk about what's going on. You're barely talking to me, avoiding looking me in the eye." "What did you expect?" Derek interrupted her abruptly. "That I'd be thrilled that I might be raising another man's child? A man with whom my wife seems to have an emotional as well as a physical connection?" His words hit exactly on target. Melissa felt the color flood her face. "It's not fair," she tried to defend herself. "You're the one who suggested this relationship, the one who said you needed a thrill. I suggested physical experimentation, not emotional betrayal." Derek's voice trailed off into a shout. He rarely raised his voice, and it scared Melissa even more than the content of his words. She clutched the ultrasound scan to her chest as if protecting the baby from this fight. "I'm sorry." Derek took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "I didn't mean to yell, it's just… This situation is more complicated than I thought, and I need to know the truth so I can decide what to do next." The truth, such a simple word for such a complex concept. Melissa wasn't sure she knew the truth about her own feelings. Yes, she felt something for Jason that went beyond mere physical attraction. But did that mean she had fallen out of love with Derek? Did she want Jason to be the father of her child, not her husband? "I understand," she said quietly. "We'll do the test and then we'll figure it out." The phone vibrated again. This time, a message. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Jason." This relentlessness was beginning to worry Melissa. Each day, Jason was becoming more insistent in his desire to be involved in her pregnancy. Carrie Ward was poring over sketches of a new design, but she couldn't concentrate. Her gaze kept returning to her husband, who had been on the phone for an hour. She knew he was trying to contact Melissa again. "You could at least pretend to be interested in something other than her pregnancy," Carrie said, dropping her pencil on the table. Jason looked away from the screen, a look of bewilderment on his face. "What are you talking about?" "That you're obsessed with this kid. Have you given a second thought to what that looks like to you? How it looks to me?" Jason put the phone down and walked over to his wife. "Carrie, I'm just worried. It's natural in a situation like this." "Natural?" Carrie grinned bitterly. "It would be natural if you were as concerned about your wife as you are about someone else's pregnancy." Jason knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Look, I know you're worried about your diagnosis, and I understand how much it hurts you to see Melissa pregnant and you… Don't you dare." Carrie threw up her hands and turned away. "Don't you dare say you understand. You have no idea what it's like to know you'll never be able to have children. And then she shows up, and after a few months of our having fun, she's pregnant. Probably by you. How do you think I should feel?" There was a look of confusion on Jason's face. He could analyze human behavior, lecture on the psychology of relationships, but in the face of real, raw emotion, he was often lost. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said sincerely. "It's just that if there's a chance it's my baby…" "Exactly, your baby, not ours." "You never said our." Carrie got up and walked to the window. Jason remained on his knees, staring after her. "I thought we had a solution," Carrie continued quietly. "When the doctors said I had no chance of getting pregnant, and we decided not to go the adoption route. I thought we agreed that we were enough for each other." "We were," Jason hastened to assure her, rising to his feet. "And we are. It's just that this situation, it's unforeseen. But you're glad about it." It wasn't a question, but a statement. "You're glad Melissa's pregnant. I see it in your eyes every time you talk about the baby." Jason didn't answer. He couldn't lie. Not to Carrie, who knew him too well. Yes, he was excited about the possibility of becoming a father. It had been unexpected, unplanned, but when Melissa had announced her pregnancy, something had awakened inside him, an instinct, a desire, a need he hadn't realized he had. "I'm sorry," was all he could say. Carrie shook her head and walked past him toward the door. "Where are you going?" Jason asked as she picked up her bag. "I need to think." Alone. The door closed, and Jason was alone in the silence of their house. He picked up his phone again and saw a text message back from Melissa. "Okay, let's meet tomorrow at the park by the lake, just you and me." The park was almost empty at this time of day. Melissa sat on a bench watching the ducks on the lake. She had arrived earlier than the appointed time, hoping to gather her thoughts before meeting Jason. "Hi." His voice made her wince. He was early, too. "Hi." Melissa smiled, trying to hide her nervousness. "Thanks for agreeing to meet me." Jason sat down next to her, keeping a distance between them. Not so great as to look intentional, but enough to avoid accidental touching. "How are you feeling?" he asked, looking not at her, but at the lake. "Physically, not bad. A little toxic in the mornings, but the doctor says that's normal." Jason nodded. There was something tense in his profile, like he was holding back a lot of words he wanted to say. Derek has signed up for the DNA test. Melissa decided to cut right to the chase. And I think you should take it too. I've already signed up. Jason turned to her. Melissa, I know this whole situation is complicated, and I understand that you and Derek have problems, but I want you to know that if the baby is mine, I will be there for you. I will be involved in his life financially and emotionally. And if it's not yours? Melissa asked bluntly. Jason was silent for a moment, pondering the answer. Then I'll back off. I will respect your family. His words were supposed to be reassuring, but somehow they had the opposite effect. Melissa felt a pang of disappointment. Had she really hoped he would fight for her and the baby, regardless of the test results? What about Carrie? She asked, trying to distract herself from those thoughts. How was she taking all this? Jason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his discomfort. It's complicated. Well, you know about her diagnosis, that she can't have children. No. Melissa looked at him in surprise. I didn't know. We never discussed it? Jason looked genuinely surprised. We found out about it 3 years ago, back in California. That's one of the reasons we agreed so easily to the experiments. We needed something to take our minds off the trauma. Melissa felt a lump come up in her throat. How could she not know something so important about the woman she'd shared such an intimate experience with? I'm so sorry, she said quietly. I can't imagine what she's going through. She'll get through this, Jason said firmly. Carrie is stronger than she looks. But we're not talking about her now. We're talking about us. You, me, the baby. Jason, Melissa pulled herself together. There is no us. There's you, there's me, there's the baby, which may or may not be yours. But we, as a couple, we don't exist. The confusion on his face changed to something akin to pain. But I thought, after everything that happened between us, I felt that I'm confused, Melissa admitted. Yes, there's something between us, but I'm married to Derek, and whatever our relationship is right now, I'm not ready to ruin it over feelings I'm not even sure I have. Jason looked away, his jaw tightening. What if the test says I'm the father? Then we'll decide how to arrange for you to be involved in the baby's life. But that doesn't mean we'll be together, Jason. He stood up abruptly and took a few steps toward the lake. You know what's ironic? He said without turning around. What started out as a game, as an experiment, has turned into the truest, most sincere feeling I've ever had. I'd never felt this way about Carrie, even though we'd been together for 7 years. Those words, spoken so openly, so rawly and honestly, pierced Melissa. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to rush to him, to admit that she felt the same way. But the other part, the more rational part, realized that would only complicate an already confusing situation. I have to go, she said, getting up from the bench. Derek's waiting for me at home. Jason turned to her at last. There was a determination in his eyes that frightened Melissa for some reason. This isn't the end of the conversation, he said. I'm not going to back down that easily, not when it's my baby. We don't know if it's your baby yet, Melissa reminded him. I know it is, Jason said firmly. I can feel it. I think you do too. Carrie knocked gently on Derek's office door. They'd agreed to meet in his office, a neutral location where they could talk without prying eyes. Come in. Derek's voice sounded tired. Carrie walked in and looked around. The financial advisor's office was an exact reflection of its owner. Understated, functional, uncluttered. Thank you for agreeing to meet, she began, sitting down in the chair across from his desk. You said it was important. Derek set aside the papers he was reviewing. Is something wrong? Carrie hesitated, not knowing how to start this difficult conversation. It's about Melissa, the baby, and Jason. She took a deep breath. Derek, I think my husband is obsessed with being the father of this baby. He doesn't talk about anything else, calling Melissa all the time, asking how she's doing. I've noticed, Derek said dryly. Melissa doesn't seem to mind his attention either. It's more than just attention, Carrie stepped forward. Derek, I know Jason. When he wants something, he doesn't stop. And right now, he wants this baby. And maybe your wife. Derek clenched his jaw so that his cheekbones set. What are you suggesting? He asked after a pause. Forbid them from communicating? That would only make things worse. No, Carrie shook her head. I'm suggesting we join together. Show them that we have a say in this situation too. How do we do that? Let's organize a meeting. All four of us. At your country house, for example. We'll discuss it openly, like adults. Derek thought about it. The suggestion sounded reasonable, but something in Carrie's tone made him wary. What do you think it would do? Clarity, Carrie answered simply. We all need clarity. We have to decide how to proceed regardless of the test results. She looked sincere, but there was something else in her eyes, something Derek couldn't read, but he had no choice. The situation really needed to be resolved. Okay, he agreed. I'll talk to Melissa. They were sitting at the table in the spacious living room of the Holtz country house. Dusk was settling in outside the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. The tension that hung in the air could have been cut with a knife. So, Derek began, breaking the awkward silence. We're here to discuss the situation and decide how to move forward. Have the tests been done yet? Carrie asked, her voice calm, but her fingers clutching the water glass were white with tension. Yes, Melissa answered. The results will be back in 3 days. And then what? Jason looked directly at Melissa, ignoring the others. What happens when we know the truth? It depends on the results, Derek said carefully. No, Jason objected sharply. The truth is that the results won't change anything. If the baby is mine, I'll fight for the right to be the father. If it's Derek's baby, well, that doesn't change how I feel about Melissa. Melissa saw Derek's face stiffen at those words. She wanted to say something, but Carrie beat her to it. Jason, you're out of line. Carrie's voice was calm, but there was a note of steel in it. We agreed on certain rules, and you've broken them by allowing yourself to become emotionally attached. Did you? Jason turned to his wife. Didn't you do the same thing with Derek? Carrie cast a quick glance at Derek, who studiously avoided looking in her direction. We're not talking about me and Derek. We're talking about you and your obsession with Melissa and her baby. Our baby, Jason corrected. Mine and Melissa's. We don't know that yet, Derek exclaimed, losing patience. And even if we do, you don't have any right to demand. I have every right. I have every right, Jason interrupted him sternly. Biological and moral. What about you, Derek? If it turns out the baby isn't yours, will you really be able to love it? Or will you see it every day as a reminder of your wife sleeping with someone else? Jason! Melissa jumped to her feet. Stop this right now! Silence hung in the room for a moment. Then Derek slowly stood up. I'll get something to drink, he said, heading for the bar in the corner of the living room. It seemed we all needed one. Carrie followed him, leaving Melissa and Jason alone. Why are you doing this? Melissa asked quietly when Derek and Carrie were out of hearing range. Why are you making this so complicated? Because I love you, Jason answered simply. Because I believe that you love me too. And because my baby deserves to grow up with his real father. We don't know that yet. We do, Jason insisted. I'm sure we do. And regardless of the outcome, Melissa, I want you to know that I would do anything for you and the baby. Anything. There was a threat in his words, a hidden promise that made Melissa feel cold. At the bar, Derek was pouring whiskey into glasses. Carrie stood beside him, watching his movements. Are you okay? She asked quietly. No, Derek answered honestly. But I'll be fine. He won't back down, Carrie said, looking over her shoulder at Jason, who was saying something to Melissa. I've never seen him so obsessed. What do you suggest? Derek asked tiredly. Carrie picked up one of the glasses and took a sip before answering. I don't know, but I'm not ready to lose my husband over a child that might not even be his. And I'm not ready to lose my wife, Derek echoed. Their gazes met, and for a moment, there was understanding between them, bitter but sincere. Let's get back to them, Derek said, taking the remaining glasses, before they decide everything without us. When they returned to the table, the atmosphere had changed. Melissa looked pale, and Jason looked even more determined, if that was even possible. I'd like to make an announcement, Melissa said when everyone was seated again. Regardless of the test results, I want to keep my marriage to Derek. Derek looked at his wife with surprise and relief. Are you sure? He asked. Yes, Melissa answered firmly. We made a mistake. All of us. But I don't want it to destroy our family. Jason shook his head. You're saying that because you're afraid, he said. Afraid of change, afraid of your real feelings. Stop talking for me, Melissa said indignantly. You don't know how I feel. I know enough. Jason stared at her with such intensity that Melissa felt naked. I know how you react to my touch, how your pulse quickens when I'm near. I know your most secret fantasies, your fears, your hopes. I know you better than you know yourself. Enough! Derek slammed his fist on the table. You're out of line, Jason. Isn't that why we're here? Jason turned to Derek with a defiant smile. Isn't that why we started this whole experiment in the first place? Carrie watched the scene silently, her face impenetrable, but her eyes flickered with something like satisfaction, as if everything was going according to some inner plan of hers. I think we should pause, she said finally. Everyone is too emotional right now. Let's continue this conversation after we know the results of the test. No, Jason said firmly. I'm not leaving until Melissa admits the truth. Not until she admits that there's something between us, something real. Jason, please! Melissa's voice was pleading. Not now, not like this. When? There was pain in his eyes. When is the right time, Melissa? After the baby's born? When Derek convinces you that it's best for everyone if I disappear from your life? Melissa felt tears come to her eyes. Everything that was happening seemed like a nightmare from which there was no waking up. I think you should leave, Derek said, rising from the table. His voice was quiet, but it was threatening. What if I don't want to? Jason stood up as well, looking at Derek with a challenge. Jason, Carrie put her hand on her husband's shoulder. That's enough. Let's go home. For a moment it looked like Jason wouldn't listen, but then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said, but this isn't the end. Not for me. When the doors closed behind the Ward couple, Melissa collapsed into herself, wrapping her arms around her head. What have we done, Derek? She whispered. How could we have gotten it so messed up? Derek sat down next to her but didn't touch her, keeping his distance. We made a mistake, he said, but we can fix it, together. 3 days later, the test results were ready. The envelope lay on the kitchen table in front of Melissa like a time bomb. Do you want to open it now? Derek asked, standing in the kitchen doorway. No, Melissa shook her head. Let's wait for them. They have a right to know too. Are you sure you want to go out again? After what happened last time? This is the last time, Melissa said firmly. We'll call it a day, and we'll go our separate ways. Derek looked at his wife for a long moment before nodding. Good. I'll call them. Friday night, Melissa arrived at the country house before anyone else. Derek stayed late at work, promising to be there in an hour. Jason and Carrie were due to arrive around the same time. The house greeted her with emptiness and silence. She and Derek used to spend weekends here often, having barbecues for friends, dreaming of raising their children here. Now it all seemed a distant past. Melissa put the envelope with the results on the coffee table in the living room and walked to the kitchen. She wanted to make some tea to calm her nerves for the upcoming conversation. As she turned on the kettle, she heard the sound of the door opening. Derek? She called out, peering out of the kitchen. You're early. But it was Carrie standing in the doorway, alone, without Jason. Hi, she said, entering the house. I hope you don't mind that I'm a little early. We need to talk. Alone. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine. Something in Carrie's eyes, in her voice, was unsettling. Of course, she replied, trying to sound normal. Tea? Coffee? Nothing, thanks. Carrie walked into the living room and noticed the envelope. Are these the results? Yes, Melissa followed her, not sure why she suddenly felt so anxious. But I thought we were going to wait for Derek and Jason. Jason's not coming, Carrie interrupted, picking up the envelope. He's busy. Something in the way she said the word made Melissa even more suspicious. What's wrong, Carrie? She asked bluntly. Something with Jason? Carrie looked up from the envelope, and Melissa saw something in her eyes that made her blood run cold. Cold, calculating rage. Do you really want to know what happened? Carrie asked quietly. To my husband? To my life? To my future? She took a step toward Melissa and she stepped back involuntarily. "Carrie, I understand that you're upset." "Upset?" Carrie laughed, but there was no mirth in that laugh. "No, Melissa, I'm not upset. I'm completely calm and I know what I have to do." Melissa felt fear squeezing her throat. She looked at her phone lying on the table, too far away to reach unnoticed. "Where's Jason, Carrie?" she asked, trying to keep her voice firm. Carrie smiled a strange, absent smile. "He's at home, sleeping very soundly." She paused. "You know, he and I met in California. I was his research assistant. Such a smart, handsome professor. Who could resist?" She spoke calmly, almost dreamily, but something in her eyes made Melissa look away. "I loved him," Carrie continued. "I really did. And you know what the funny thing is? I really can't have kids, but not because of nature. It's because Jason convinced me to get sterilized. It's for your own good, honey. Why do we need kids when we have each other? And now," her voice trembled, "now he wants a baby. Your baby." "Carrie," Melissa made a soothing gesture. "Whatever is going on between you two, we can work it out. Jason, what did you do to him?" "Nothing irreparable." "Bye." Carrie opened her purse and pulled out a gun. "Unlike what I'm about to do to you and your baby." Melissa froze, staring at the weapon in Carrie's hands. It was unreal, a gun in the hands of a woman who not so long ago had been discussing designs with her and laughing at the same jokes. "You wouldn't do that," Melissa said, trying to sound confident. "You're not a killer, Carrie. Do you know what I am?" Carrie tilted her head, studying Melissa like some interesting insect. "You don't know anything about me. No one does. Not even Jason." Melissa was thinking feverishly. Windows? Too far away. The door? Carrie stands between her and the exit. Shout. To whom? The house is in a secluded spot. The nearest neighbor's half a mile away. "Derek will be here soon," she said, retreating to the fireplace. "And Jason will be looking for you." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Carrie smiled. "That they'll come and find you. It'll be educational for both of them." Melissa felt the fireplace toolbox against her back. If she could just grab a poker without being seen. "You haven't even opened the results," she said, trying to distract Carrie. "Maybe the baby isn't Jason's. Maybe it's Derek's. What difference does it make?" Carrie shrugged. "Either way, that baby ruined my life." She took another step forward, raising the gun. "Goodbye, Melissa. It's nothing personal. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Melissa leaned in sharply, grabbing the poker, but Carrie was faster. The sound of gunfire echoed through the empty house. When Detective Rachel Moreno's phone rang at 2 a.m, she knew it was no good. She was met at the crime scene by a young officer whose face was paler than the moon illuminating the picturesque suburban lot. "What have we got?" Moreno asked, putting on her gloves. "Female, 29 years old, 1 gunshot wound," the officer reported. "Her husband found her when he got home from work around 11 p.m. Victim's name? Melissa Holt. She was pregnant." Moreno closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. The murders of pregnant women were the worst. "Husband?" she asked. "Derek Holt, 41, financial consultant. He's in the hospital right now under medical care. Shock." Moreno nodded and headed toward the house. In the spacious living room, the medical examiners were already finishing their work. On the floor, outlined in chalk, lay the body of a young woman. Beside her was a blood-stained poker. "She tried to defend herself," said the chief examiner, approaching Moreno. "Judging by the nature of the wound and the blood spatter, there was a struggle between her and her attacker. Time of death? Presumably between 7 o'clock and 8 p.m. Moreno looked around. On the coffee table lay an open envelope and papers, scattered as if in a hurry or struggle. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the papers. "The results of the paternity test," the examiner replied. "Apparently, the husband is the biological father of the child." Moreno looked at the papers thoughtfully. Why a paternity test? And why was it so important that someone had decided to test it before killing the woman? "Any signs of forced entry?" she asked. None. Apparently the victim let the killer in on her own." Moreno nodded and walked to the window. In the moonlight, the country house looked like an idyllic picture from a real estate magazine. Who would have thought such tragedy lurked behind those walls? "Interview the neighbors, check the cameras at the entrance to the village," she ordered. "And I need to talk to my husband as soon as the doctors give the okay." Something about this case didn't add up. Why was a pregnant woman alone in a country house? Who was she waiting for? And what did this paternity test mean? Moreno felt there was much more behind this murder than met the eye, and she was determined to get to the truth, no matter how unpleasant it turned out to be. Detective Rachel Moreno sat in her office looking at the crime scene photos. It had been a week since Melissa Holt's murder, and the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. On the board in front of her were pictures of the victim, a diagram of the suburban house, ballistics results, and photos of the main players in the case: Derek Holt, Jason Ward, and his wife Carrie. Red threads stretched between them, symbolizing the connections that were getting more and more complicated every day. "Coffee," came the voice of her partner, Lieutenant Coleman. He placed a steaming cup in front of her and sat down across from her. "Any news?" "They didn't find the gun." Moreno sipped her hot drink. "None of the security cameras picked up any suspicious vehicles that night, only Melissa's car and later Derek's." "What about a couple of swingers?" Coleman nodded at the photos of the Wards. Jason Ward claims he was at home all evening, unconscious. According to him, his wife put something in his whiskey, and he didn't wake up until midnight. By then, Carrie was gone. "So where is she?" "That's the question." Moreno stood up and walked over to the board. No credit cards used, cell phone turned off. It was like she vanished into thin air. Coleman tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. Could this be a classic love triangle? Jealous wife kills her husband's mistress? More like a quadrangle, Moreno corrected. 2 husbands, 2 wives, a messed up relationship, and a child that could have been by either man. She pointed to a copy of the DNA test. But the result showed that the biological father is Derek Holt. And that clears him of suspicion? On the contrary, Moreno shook her head. Anyone could have motive, including Derek himself. Carrie Ward's car was found in the airport parking lot 2 days later. No traces of blood, no weapon, just a couple of psychology books and a dry cleaning receipt. Cameras captured her entering the airport terminal 4 hours after the estimated time of the murder. Her hair was shorter and darker, her clothes were different from her usual style, but none of the cameras captured her boarding the plane, and no tickets in her name were found in the system. She wanted us to think she had escaped, Moreno told her partner. But where was she really headed? The breakthrough came on the 9th day of the investigation. A call from the lab woke Moreno at 3 a.m. Detective? It's Carson from Forensics. We found something interesting in the DNA test results." "I'm listening." Moreno sat up in bed, instantly awake. "We rechecked the samples, and it turns out the result was tampered with. The document found at the crime scene is a fake." "Are you sure?" "Positive. We contacted the lab that supposedly ran the test. They have no record of such a test." Moreno felt her pulse quicken. "This changes everything," she said. "I need to talk to Derek Holt, now." "Fake?" Derek Holt looked genuinely surprised. "But, we did submit samples for the test. They were sitting in an interview room at the police station." Derek, gaunt from his wife's death, looked even more haggard under the fluorescent lights. "What lab?" Moreno asked. "Med lab." Carrie suggested it. She knew someone there, said the results would be faster. Moreno and Coleman looked at each other. "Mr. Holt, Med lab doesn't exist," Moreno said. "At least not in our state." Derek turned pale. "But that means that no one saw the real test results," Moreno finished for him. "And either you were in on the forgery or you were a victim of it, like your wife." It was Carrie. All the evidence pointed to her. Further investigation showed she booked a motel room in the suburbs under an assumed name a week before the murder. A wig matching Carrie's appearance on airport security footage was found in a nearby dumpster. And then there was a report from the Border Patrol that a woman matching Carrie Ward's description had been spotted crossing the border into Mexico. But when agents arrived at the address, all they found was an empty room and a ferry ticket to South America. The psychology professor seemed genuinely shattered by what had happened. Tests confirmed the presence of a potent sleeping pill in his blood on the night of the murder. but his cell phone showed that a text message had been sent to Melissa that night, an offer to meet at a country house. Someone with access to his phone had lured the victim into a trap. She planned the whole thing, Moreno said, closing the case file. In front of her was an international search warrant for Carrie Ward. Faked a test result, sedated her husband, used his cell phone to lure Melissa, and then staged her own escape. But why? Coleman asked. Because of jealousy? Moreno tapped her finger on the table thoughtfully. Perhaps, or because of something deeper, something to do with her inability to have children. She couldn't bear the thought of Melissa having a child, possibly with her husband. And the actual test results? Coleman asked. Who was really the father? That's something we may never know, Moreno replied. But it seems Carrie decided it was better for neither of them to know the truth. She signed the search warrant and closed the folder. The case had been reclassified as unsolved until the suspect was apprehended. But Detective Moreno was sure that no matter how cunning Carrie Ward was, sooner or later she would make a mistake. And then justice would be served. In the meantime, two men whose lives were ruined by the same fateful idea of experimenting in a relationship were left alone with their pain, guilt, and eternal questions about what could have been if they had chosen a different path.